Hi everybody, good evening. FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos here, and today we're going to respond to a viewer request. Even though he retracted it, I still think it's maybe worth doing. So in one of the viewer question, in the viewer question thread, someone asked about a Bronstein tribute, and then he kind of retracted it because he noted that I had done such a show elsewhere on the Play Chess server, but it was a long time ago, and I only did little bits. It was more, I think, I've done a number of Bronstein games over there. I think there was one show where I looked at some little excerpts, but here I think we'll do it a little bit more slowly in terms of how long we spent on each excerpt, and there are quite a few ones that I didn't present there that I will present now. And I think here the idea will be to present it as a series of tactical exercises. So there'll be a little bit of overlap, but I think it's distinct enough that it's worth your while, even if you did see that show, which is fairly unlikely, most likely. All right. Well, at any rate, let me say a few words about David Bronstein. So he was a Ukrainian grandmaster. I think he ended up in Russia. Lived from 1924 to I think 2006 is when he passed away. Great player. Once he was extremely close to winning the World Championship. So he drew a match for the title in 1951. It was a 12-12 draw with Botvinnik, and since Botvinnik was the defending champion, he kept his title. Bronstein was up by a game with 2 to go, and lost an endgame in game 23 in his last black game of the match, and that allowed Botvinnik to save his title. In fact, Bronstein played quite a few shaky endings in that match and really could very easily have won it. After that, he never got back to the highest level, but still was very close. In 1953, he tied for second in the candidates tournament then, and played in the 56 candidates as well. He was extremely close to making the candidates in 59 and in 64, had a bit of bad luck on those occasions, and continued to be a very, very strong grandmaster for many years after that. Was also an outstanding writer. Many of you are familiar with the famous book of the 1953 candidates, Zurich 53, which he co-authored with his friend Boris Weinstein, and it's again one of the classics of chess literature. Was also very much an innovator, both within chess and let's say outside of the over-the-board experience, but still within the broad chess context. What I mean by that is that he was an inventor of something very much like Chess 960, some slight differences, but basically he had the idea before Fischer or others. Although I think there were also people before Bronstein who found the idea. So it is the sort of idea that has occurred to more than one person through chess history. He also proposed playing with increments before that ever before that ever came into play. He was also an advocate of active chess before that really got hot, and there were a number of other innovations and let's say rarities that he suggested, and was always willing to play too. So he was a great lover of exhibition games of various sorts. He played mutual simultaneouses, so like he and Tal, I think, once played on 8 boards or 10 boards simultaneously against each other. So this kind of creative and freewheeling attitude is one that you can see in his chess as well. Brilliant tactician, loved original ideas, came up with some fantastic opening ideas, of course, but just within the game itself, I mean, he was a great improviser, and we'll see some of the beautiful tactical ideas that he devised. He was also one of the founding fathers, you might say, of the King's Indian defense, at least in its modern interpretations. Anyway, his contributions to the game are just colossal, and it's only, I think, because he just narrowly failed to win the world title that he isn't better known and perhaps as beloved a player as Mikhail Tal is to many players. So, without any further ado, let's take a look at some of his great combinations, and we'll start with a famous game against Ludek Pachman from a King's Indian defense played back in 1946 in a Moscow-Prague match. Okay, so Bronstein has black here. White's just played the move rook e2 to d2, shoring up the knight on d4. So here's a good place. Stop the recording. See if you can figure out what black's move ought to do. Okay, well, it's clear, or I think there's going to be a fairly obvious sense that something bad might happen to white on squares like d4 and b3. So a very obvious continuation here would be bishop takes d4, rook takes d4, and now rook takes a1, deflecting the rook, and then knight takes b3. And this position is in fact winning for black. He's going to be up a pawn at the very least, but white's position is going to be dreadfully bad. So his king is bad, his pawns are bad, and he's already down material to start with after black recaptures one of the rooks. Well, if you guessed that bishop takes d4 was the move, you're on the right track, but you're wrong in the specifics. And actually, this isn't a bad place to figure out why this is bad. So before we get to the right move for black, let's figure out why bishop takes d4 isn't the best move. Well, the answer is this nasty little Zwischenzug, knight a4, counterattacking the queen, as well as really piling up on the bishop on d4. Okay, black should take on g3, and with this he can get a slight advantage. So hg3, fg3, knight takes a4, and now not bishop takes d4, but b takes a4. So we're attacking the queen with the rook. So we've got the threat on the b file, and we maintain the threat against the bishop on d4. Now the reason why h takes g3 was kind of important to flick in is that black now has bishop to g1 check. And after queen g1, takes, and rook a4, white's down a pawn. He should take this and get rid of his weak c-pawn in exchange for something. And white is not in that bad a shape. I mean, his bishop on a1 is really a very nice piece. And because of this, he has pretty reasonable chances to hold, but definitely black is better here, and it's definitely not what... I mean, black is better, but okay, this is not nearly as much better as what he could have in the game. So let's go back. And instead of bishop takes d4, we invert the move order, and we play rook takes a1. And this is a good rule of thumb for combinations. If you see a combinational idea, a combinative idea, and you see that the order A, B, C doesn't work because the defender has some useful little trick, it's often worth looking to see, well, what about BAC instead, or CAB, or some inversion of the moves, or some reordering of the moves. And often that works, and so it does here. So with rook takes a1, okay, there's no knight to a4 business now. And after rook a1, now bishop takes d4, now knight takes b3, and black is winning. As we can see, white played rook takes d6, and now another accurate move by black, not knight a1, it's probably better there too, but queen takes f2 is just killing. Black has so many threats here. So, of course, he's threatening the rook. That's obvious. But he's also threatening queen takes g3 and queen takes c3. And also the combination, knight a1 and then queen g3 and queen takes d6 even. So there's also that. And do you see a third potential black threat? Or maybe fourth, depending on how you count the queen takes g3 stuff. So even a fourth threat is bishop takes h3, threatening queen takes g2 mate. Bishop takes h3 would be illegal in reply, and if king takes h3, then queen g3 is once again mate. So, white's in colossal trouble here. So he played rook a2, black took the knight, and the rest was pretty straightforward. Rook a3, another nice blow here. Bishop takes h3. So rook b3, takes, queen c4, and alright, white's up the exchange, but black has 4 pawns, and the e4 pawn doesn't really inspire confidence either. White's king is wide open, and the game ended quite quickly. Rook d4, queen e6, rook takes b7, rook a8, queen e2, h3, and he had enough. White resigned here. Okay, so a very nice combination by Bronstein, and it showed really at the time that black has a big bag of tricks in the King's Indian. There are a lot of tactical possibilities that are open to him, and we saw them in action here. Now, it's almost impossible to give this Pachman game without also showing his famous game against Zita from the same event. So can clearly see some similarities. White has just played h3, and it looks like black's formation is almost the same. And again, we have similar tactical ideas to look at. So once again, stop the recording, figure out what black to move ought to do. Okay, well, let's take a look. There are a couple of possibilities that should spring to mind. One very natural idea is to just leap in and play knight takes f2. For instance, if king takes f2, well, here we have a choice between a couple of moves. At first sight, knight takes b3 looks really strong. But rook takes b3, bishop d4 check, king f1, queen b3, and everything is well up to this point, but ooh, queen takes d4, and suddenly this long diagonal here, this bishop here and the queen here, and the trip to g7 or h8 looks a bit menacing. So this is kind of unclear. However, black is okay in this position if he plays rook takes a1. So once again, familiar motif, and we'll come back to a position like this soon enough. Okay, so king takes f2 loses to rook takes a1. Alright, well, what about queen takes f2? Well, again, rook takes a1 is strong. And in fact, knight to d3 is also pretty good here too. So does that mean that the solution is knight takes f2? Well, the answer is no. And once again, I invite you to figure out what's wrong with knight takes f2 before we get to the right move for black, instead of this knight move. Well, the answer, once again, is our friend knight to a4. And this once again upsets the apple cart here. So black has nothing more than equality after takes, queen c5, and white is one apiece. And so black is okay because he gets the a pawn and then he gets the c pawn, but white's certainly not losing here. So in a position like this, it's pretty unclear. Black's got the 3 pawns. They're not especially dangerous just yet, but they're certainly adequate. And white's e4 pawn is a bit weak too. So both sides have slight drawbacks in the position. Anyway, basically white is okay. White's surviving here. So thanks to knight a4, knight takes f2 is not the killer. The strongest move is rook takes a1 once again. Okay, now if h takes g4, if nothing else, black could swap rooks and then play bishop takes g4. Okay, so that's there at the very, very least. Probably might be even better, but minimally black has that, winning a pawn with a lot of pressure. So rook takes a1 is forced, and only now knight takes f2, and this is killing. So if king takes f2, knight takes b3, and thanks to the pin, you can see white's just going to get obliterated here. So his queen's under attack, the knight's under attack, the rook's under attack, and even this knight on c3 can be vulnerable to queen takes d4, check, and then taking on c3. So that's worthless for white. If queen takes f2, knight to d3, queen d2, knight e1, and okay, white's down a pawn here already, but weak everywhere. So the knight on d4 is of course hanging, and it's pinned, and if he protects it, then black has knight takes g2 if nothing else. The b3 pawn is kind of loose, so this is winning for black. So Zita tried rook to e3, and okay, he's up the exchange for a pawn, but his position is shaky, and black played knight takes h3. So it doesn't bother with any combinations with b3, just wins another pawn here and chases the king out. So king h2, and now another very attractive move, knight to f2, threatening knight to g4 check, and if queen takes d4, bishop takes d4 is lethal. So the game ended. Took a little longer than the other game, but black won pretty comfortably. So rook f3, takes here, queen f4, check, f5, and at this point black has 2 minor pieces and 2 pawns for the rook, more than enough, fine position to boot. This leads nowhere. After rook a8, bishop e5 chases it out, and hello, now all of a sudden there's more attack coming against the white king. So queen a2, queen f8, very nice move. So he bounces out to h6 here. So pretty cool maneuver here by the black queen. And after bishop h3, queen h6, Zita threw in the towel. The problem is if king g2, rook to d2 check, and if queen at g2, okay, probably if nothing else, rook to d1 is going to be strong. So white gave up here. He's down a lot of material and in big trouble besides that. Okay, so there's our second combination from Bronstein. Let's look at number 3. And this time he has white. And we start here. And this is, we start at this point. So black has just played knight to d7, attacking the queen. And what should white do? So there's an obvious move, and it's an interesting move, but anyway, I don't want to give any hints away, so figure out what white should play. Okay, well, let's look at the two, I would say, most significant moves here. All right, now, those of you who are, let's say, have a kind of puzzle book mentality, I'm sure looked very quickly at queen takes g7 check, and rightly so. It's a move that definitely deserves to be looked at. In fact, Kotov admitted after the game, this was played by the way, so it's Bronstein Kotov from the Moscow Championship in 1946. So third game that we've looked at in a row from that year. So he admitted after the game that this was the only move that he had looked at. And so king takes g7, bishop e7 check, king h8, and now white has a couple of very dangerous tries, but they don't quite seem to work. So first, well, okay, let's think about this. We'd love to play bishop to f6 mate. Of course, it's not mate because, hey, there's a knight in the way. So the next thing you might think is, well, gee, if we just move this knight out of the way, then we have rook takes d7, and then bishop to f6 is mate. So let's start with knight to f5. So we clear the path here. And note, too, there's a neat little try. So if f6, with the idea that now bishop, takes f6 is no longer a threat, there is a second problem, which is knight to h6. And now the threat is to take on f8 and then either give mate on g8 or on f7. So this is in fact winning for white. So what does black do here? Take a moment and figure it out. Well, the answer is that he can just grab the knight. And on rook takes d7, queen c6 is forced. Okay, well, it's very helpful for black that if bishop takes f8, black can play, well, he can take either way. Let's just say with the bishop. And, okay, after bishop to g7 check, king g8, there's no mate, there's nothing to attack with the bishop discovery. And in fact, he can't even get a draw by perpetual with bishop to h6 because queen g6 takes, and black is much better. Well, he's up the exchange for a pawn. Should be a win, I think, but certainly it's not desirable for white. But okay, after queen to c6, another idea is to play rook to d6. But again, takes, and now rook e8, stopping bishop to e5, developing the rook, and again, black is a bit better here. So the upshot then is that after queen g7, king g7, takes here, knight f5 doesn't win. Another try though is knight to c6, and on queen c6, rook to d7. Now here, the move that in fact Bronstein mentions in his notes is e5, but he thought that black was okay here, but in fact white is winning in this case, or much better. Rook to d6 again, takes, rook e8, but now knight to d5 is really strong. Not only threatening, of course, to take on b6, that's kind of small potatoes. Knight to c7 is much more serious, but also knight f6 is pretty serious as well, because this rook has to keep g8 covered and e5 covered. So some difficulties here. And again, of course, knight c7 is a threat. So if rook to a7, then knight f6 is probably strong, maybe winning. If black does something to take care of knight f6, like moving the bishop out, then knight c7. So black is in some trouble here. However, after rook takes d7, black can very coolly play the move h5, giving his king room to run, and in fact he's just winning here. So white has too many guys hanging and not quite enough attack to really make this work. Okay, so queen takes g7 doesn't quite cut the mustard. Did you see the move that does? It's actually very simple once you look. Once the move crosses your mind, it's very simple to work it out. And it's just bishop to h6. And here Kotov resigned. So we've got a triple attack against the g-pawn. And, okay, there's no way to defend it. If he plays bishop to f6, we just play bishop takes g7 and destroy everything and mate him. So knight takes e5, but bishop g7, bishop takes e5, and after one spite interposition, it's checkmate. So hope you found that and didn't get too carried away by queen takes g7. It's a fun line. I mean, it's worth calculating, but this is just very simple and decisive. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Okay, this one's actually pretty complicated, and I might want to come back to this. So maybe we'll break this up into a couple of shows, and we'll come back to this one. Okay, yeah, this is a nice and simple one. This is Bronstein against Geller from the Soviet Championship in 1961. And actually, let me go through this game kind of quickly because it shows a well-known plan in action. So it's a Nimzo Indian. Bronstein had white. Plays the same-ish, the idea of which is to build up a big pawn center and try to gain space, which will then be used in building up a kingside attack. So f3, d5, takes, e3. And now, those of you who are familiar with the very, very famous game Bronstein-Capablanca from the Avro 1938 tournament will have seen this plan that white has of playing bishop to d3, knight e2, castles, knight comes to g3, and then white prepares and finally executes e4, and then e5, f4, and so on, with a massive kingside attack. So, understandably, black played this prophylactic move bishop to f5, with the point of swapping off at least the light squared bishops and giving white both a little less support of the e4 advance, and also just getting rid of this bishop that's pointing towards black's king. Okay, so knight e2, knight f4, bishop to d3. Okay, white castles, black brings his rooks to useful files, rook to b1. And then here black got kind of experimental. Certainly the position is playable still at this point. But black chose queen to a5. Dangerous idea, but he's counting on his queenside counterplay and thinks that this is going to outweigh the pawn and the fact that this rook is on the 7th rank. So here he plays knight to b6. And now white played g4. So a very, very aggressive aim here. So h6, h4. And now Geller played c takes d4. So his idea is that after g5, which is what happened, d takes e3, gf6, rook c3, all of a sudden he's got pretty reasonable counterplay. So he's down a piece, that's true, but he's got a couple of pawns for it. This pawn on e3 looks pretty good. And, okay, it's a messy position. I'm sure white's better here. Well, of course white's better. But let's say white would be normally a little bit better, but again, it's kind of murky here. Anyway, figure out what white in this let me try that sentence again. Stop the recording here and see if you can figure out what white played in this position. Okay, well, white has a couple of good moves here, and Bronstein in fact saw both of them. One very good move is rook takes f7. And if rook takes d3, we've got mate in 2 with rook takes g7 followed by knight to g6. If king takes on f7, then queen to g6 is quite strong. But there are some ways for white to at least, for black to at least delay the mate. So rook takes f7 does lead to a forced mate, just takes a little bit longer. So the best move, at least by virtue of being the most efficient, is queen to g6, and this just forces mate in 2 more moves. And there's absolutely nothing that black can do about it. Not even spite moves to delay it. Queen takes g7, mate is the threat, and there's absolutely no way to stop it except to take the queen. But then rook g7 and knight takes g6 is mate. So very nice. Not too difficult, but still a very attractive way of coordinating all his pieces. Okay, on to the next one. This is a reasonably famous example. This was played in a Leningrad versus Moscow match in 1962. None other than the great Viktor Korchnoi had the black pieces here, and he's in a bit of trouble. So he's down a pawn, his king is a bit exposed. Really, his king's being exposed is the main thing. But he thought that this was a very useful moment for him to kind of launch into a counterattack, which he did with the move queen takes f3. So probably queen to d7, or maybe king to g6 gave him better chances to survive, but it's a difficult situation in any case. Okay, well, he played queen takes f3, and now try to figure out what white's move should do. So, of course, rook h8 check is super obvious, but we have to try to work out the win from there. And you don't have much of a margin for error because, of course, a catastrophe is waiting to happen on g2. So whatever white comes up with, it had better be decisive, or else he's going to have to kind of head back and play defense. Okay, well, the solution that Bronstein found starts with rook to h8 check, of course, king g6, and now not queen to e8 check. So this is, again, a very natural move, a very obvious move. There are a lot of situations where this is what you ought to play, but black can defend safely with queen to f7. Queen to e4 check, let's say, king g5, and there's no good checks here. In fact, king to h3 is kind of a nice quiet move, now threatening to play queen to e5 check, but after queen to d5, it's kind of remarkable, but really all the key squares are covered. White could play queen to e7 check, but black just plays king to g6, and so what? There's really nothing happening with that. So queen to e8 check, as dangerous and obvious as it is, isn't the right move. So one more chance. If you had come up with queen to e8, take another try. See if you can do better. Okay, well, the answer is rook takes h6 check. Very attractive little combination. And the point is that black is in fact going to lose his queen, whichever way he recaptures. If he takes with the pawn, then we have a two-move skewer here, followed by queen takes f3. And if king takes h6, okay, this is a little bit more interesting, but still quite straightforward. Queen to h8 check, and it doesn't matter if black plays king g6 or g5, transposes. So here, well, it transposes after king f6. Okay, king f4 is independent. On this, white plays queen f5, and then queen takes f3, and then queen takes b3, completely winning. All right, on king f6, well, the punchline is g5 check. So discovering an attack on the queen, white plays queen f3 next, and the position is a win for white. So a nice little combination, and a nasty surprise for Korchnoi and his time pressure. Okay, let's take a look at the next game. So this one is really, really famous. Probably all of you guys have seen this. Yeah, it's exaggerating, but I'm sure a lot of you have seen this. Okay, so this is a game against Makinis from the Soviet Championship in 1965. The position is about equal here, but white has to do something about his b2 pawn. Now, he could play queen to d4, and this would be all right as well. But he plays rook to b4. And this looks pretty natural. So he protects the pawn. The rook wasn't doing anything on h4 anyway. And also, we can note that white has a threat here, or black has a threat here, which was the move queen to e1 check. If rook takes e1, then rook e1 is mating. And if after queen to e1, white plays queen to f1, well, then there's queen takes h4. So that's yet another argument in favor of rook to b4. So this looks quite logical. All right, there might be a problem with it, but what is it? So it's not queen to e1 check because queen f1 takes care of everything. So what do you think? Well, the answer, last chance here, is rook takes a3. And after this bone crusher, Machinist resigned. Why? Well, it's a double attack. He's threatening to take the rook, and he's threatening to take the queen. And there isn't really any good way to defend it. So, let's take a look at the options. If queen takes a3, well, now the queen can no longer go back to f1, so queen to e1 check, and it's mate next move. If b takes a3, well, queen takes a1 check, white blocks with whatever, and then rook to e1 check, again forces mate. If rook takes a3, then queen to e1 check, forces mate. So, no panacea here either. And then finally, if white tries to retreat with queen to d1, then rook takes a1, queen takes a1, and queen e1 once again forces mate. Next move. So, very nice little combination by Bronstein, and a very famous one as well. But it's very unusual. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen this motif. Maybe I've seen it once or twice since then, people kind of copycatting it, but even then, I mean, it wasn't really that close. I mean, this is a fairly unique tactic in the history of chess. Okay, on to the next one. Actually, yeah, this one is a little bit more involved too. So I think I'll save this for next time and discuss the two somewhat more complicated examples in a subsequent lecture. So I hope you enjoyed this little tactical Bronstein festival here, and we'll continue it next week. So thanks a lot, and I'll see you then. Bye-bye.